Hello, I'm Pastor Jerry Johnson, and I'm here to talk about the Gospel of John, which is our Bible study that we are doing for the fall this year, and maybe into a little bit of the spring of next year. It's our interactive Bible study. Unfortunately, I did not record this message, so I'm doing it again, and in the hope that I can share some information with all of you. This is kind of an intro. I just want to talk about John different from the other Gospels and shed some light on why John is so exciting and so different because the Gospel is definitely very much falls into that category. The other three Gospels are known as the Synoptic Gospels. That Synoptic means that they basically come from the same school. They're basically very similar. They have the same spine, the same, if you will, storyline. John does not, where the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, all talk about really their principal message is the kingdom of God is coming. The kingdom of God is coming. It's a repeated line that Jesus gives and the gospel writers present all through the Gospels. John, that's not the key. The key is the salvation. Our saving grace comes from Jesus Christ. And in John, Jesus tells us it's through him. There's absolutely no question about what Jesus's purpose and who he is and what's going through. And it's a little bit more nebulous in the other three Gospels. However, when you get to the end of their Gospels, Jesus does, after his resurrection, does show that he is the one, the true God. But John, there's no question in it whatsoever. He goes right from beginning to end. Jesus is God, acts like God, talks like God, and walks like God. It's just, that's the way it is for John. And that unique perspective gives us a whole different aspect of what the gospel is about. So let's go through a little bit of this. When you think of the gospel writers, they each talk about their world. They're talking to their world, to the situation they're in. The German word, it's the only three German words I know, is Sitzenleben, which means place and time. And the gospel writers are writing to a specific audience in a specific place at a specific time. And so they use language and things that are real to those people in that time. And sometimes that gets caught up in changing the actual, if you will, facts or the actual, history of events. When I teach the kids, I have an example I use. I will tell the children in the class, I say, hey, I remember the Vietnam War, and there was this guy that they talked as hero who ran a helicopter, and he would scour through the woods where the fighters were, and he would with his cell phone, he would call down to all the people that were down there, if there were any people, and they'd call up to him, and he'd figure out where their location is and go down and save them or land, and they would come into the helicopter and off they go and get them out of the woods. To us, we're going like, what? There wasn't any cell phones back then. But the kids, there was nothing wrong with that. They didn't know there was any cell phones back then. They got the story of this hero. So the context matters in how you tell the story, and context matters in how that story is received by the people that are there. So Mark's context, he wrote in around 70 Common Era, 70 years after Christ's birth. And his context is the sack of Jerusalem. When Jerusalem is overtaken by the Romans in 70, Mark is very conscious of that and very aware that part of the message of Jesus might be lost, so they start writing it down. Matthew is writing to a Jewish community, probably in Antioch, and they're reestablishing, again, the death of some of Jesus's apostles and being taken out of Jerusalem, and their desire to continue with the message has made them, especially in terms of Jesus' teaching, make them want to go and write down the Gospel of Matthew, which is heavy on Jesus' teaching. Luke writes to a Greek audience. He kind of converts the whole Jesus thing into a Greek story. It's for a Greek community, probably in Turkey, Asia Minor. And his thing is not so much about what Jesus says, but more of what Jesus does and the impact of that. And then John was also in Turkey. John was a later point in time. He wrote to an audience, but John's basis, who he is with, his people, who his witnesses are, how he depended on his information are all different. And at 100 BC, or pardon me, 100 CE, the church was very much in not the church, the synagogues, the Jewish people who have invited the conversation about Jesus into their life was very much divided. And when it got to John talking about Jesus as being God, that became problematic for hardline Jews. So the Jews kicked them out of the synagogue. And at that point in time in Roman history, if you were a Roman, you believed in Roman gods, and the only exemption to that were to Jewish people could believe in their God. So to be kicked out of the seminary, to be kicked out of the synagogue was, in a sense, saying that you were not a law-abiding citizen, worshiping either a Jewish God or a Roman God, and therefore you were a criminal. So that's sort of the whole persecution process. And certainly the Jews who were kicking them out of the synagogue were going to the Roman people and telling them, hey, here's some people that are worshiping something else. In fact, along that line, the first thing that Christians were called, their first thing that they were called was atheists, because they didn't believe in the Jewish or the Roman gods. So that's what happened. John picks up on that idea, the fear of the Jews, and always talks about, oh, the Jews did this, Jews did this for fear of the Jews. That's why they did this. And that was something that came from his Sitz and Leben, his place and time. Who wrote it? Matthew could have been Matthew, but it's pretty much very unlikely. Matthew being Levi the apostle, it might have been a crony or a protege of Matthew, or somebody that was very much involved, younger, but involved in the Jewish community at Antioch. Mark was younger, perhaps John Mark, who's mentioned all the time in Acts, and he's a friend of Peter. All the information and all the resources that he has, especially embarrassing aspects of Peter's life, would not have come to print if they weren't approved and purposely put together by Peter's self-admission. Luke was a Greek Christian. He was also noted in Acts. We always used to believe he was a doctor because of his use of medical terms, but usually somebody that was very educated would have that kind of medical knowledge. In addition to that, he was very, his language, his use of the Greek language was very sophisticated, which you can spot Luke's writing from the other Gospels a mile away because of his sophistication in language. You would say Mark's language in terms of Greek was on like a sixth grade level, if you will, and Luke is, college level. That's kind of the difference. John comes from a community or a group. It's constantly edited. It's repetitive at some places. And it was believed a long time that John, the gospel writer John, also wrote the John epistles, 1 John and 2 John, 3 John and 4 John, and Revelations was written by John and Potamos. But the John of the epistles and Revelations were written by other Johns. But it's possible that all of them, and I think the epistles, are very much a part of what we call as the Johannine community, a group of people that kind of emerged, had their shared witnesses, and the people that landed in Turkey. So that's Mary and John, and maybe perhaps Mary, the mother of God, then Lazarus, Mary and Martha, the Essenes, John the Baptist's followers, John the Elder, who's the writer of the epistles, John the Seer, who wrote in Revelations, Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea. They're all possible people and specific witnesses that may be related to the book and to the people of the Johannine community. The Essenes, there were three types of leaders in Israel, Jewish leaders that were in Israel at the time. The three types were Sadducees, which we've heard about. They're the temple dudes. And then there's the Pharisees, which were the people that were out in the parish synagogues. And then there were the Essenes. And the Essenes were a conservative group that were very Masonic, like a brother or the brothers or the monks, and they're separate outside the city. Most of them did get married, they lived simple lives, and they were to be the soldiers in this big fight, this celestial fight between good and evil that they perceived that God was going to have. And that when that good and evil fight would happen, that they would come and help God win the battle. And so that was their whole purpose, to be on the ready, to preserve Judaism the way God wanted it to be preserved. So when Israel was sacked, or when Israel was attacked, because the Zionists revolted against Rome, and the Romans came, the Essenes saw that. This is around 70 Common Era. The Essenes saw that as that big celestial battle, and the Romans just decimated the city of Israel. The Essenes escaped, and they escaped to Herod's fortress called Masada. There's a movie about Masada, and the not John the Seer, the teacher of righteousness, and him taking the last bastions of the Essenes up, and the Romans surrounding them and waiting them out, and constantly just putting the Masada, the Essenes, under siege. And then when the Romans finally did break down the walls to get inside to capture the Essenes jumped off the cliff. They would rather die than to be in a captive to the Romans. So yes, if there was any Essenes left, they were part of the traditions of the Johannine community, or at least we believe that anyway. The Synoptic Gospels, this little chart up here is a pretty popular chart. There's two resources that are common in the Synoptic Gospels, and that is the Gospel of Mark and the Q, which is some source we've never found, but one believed to exist because there are common, Q is German for sayings, there are common sayings in both Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark, and that commonality is known as Q. M is the things that are particular to Matthew, L is the things that are particular to Luke, but by and large, Matthew uses 100% of Mark, Luke uses 74% of Mark. So if you want an interesting question, ask me sometime, what is the parts of Mark that are not used by Luke? That's a whole nother story. So John is a completely different version. It's really interesting that when John tells the same story that's in the Synoptic Gospels, that his witnesses reflect the same thing. And I think, there is a purpose. Thank God for the wisdom of keeping 4 separate Gospels, because we see 4 different perspectives of the same situations and the same witness to Jesus Christ. If you're asking, well, which one really happened, you're asking the wrong question, because to each one of the gospel writers, all 4 of those things happened. The question isn't which one of them happened. The question is, what influence did Jesus have on the gospel writer and these different communities, and how did their writings and their perspectives shape that perspective? And I think that's really a cool and important way of looking at it, because if we were there, we'd have a completely different perspective of Jesus altogether. we would focus on the things that were important to us. So I think not taking that away from each one of the gospel writers and having them share that with us as independent writings is really, really important and valuable. The main message of the synoptics is the kingdom of God, and in John, it is Jesus Christ is the root of salvation. So what's kind of really cool when you look at this is that Mark's the incarnation. When Jesus comes, in Mark is in the baptism. That's where he starts. And Matthew and Luke, it's in the nativity scene. And then in John, who's written the latest, it's at the beginning of time. So it seems like the incarnation gets earlier and earlier with the later writers. And then the earliest presence of Jesus is in the latest writers and moves towards the earliest writers. So Mark has a very human aspect of Jesus. Matthew and Luke, Matthew has more of a teaching Jesus. Luke has more of a kind, justice Jesus. And John has a God Jesus. I mean, that's basically the way it breaks out and is shown. So the uniqueness of John, there's some characteristics that are just typically very unique. In the first part of John 1, Jesus is described as the Word. He's with God during creation. He is the Word. Now, think about that for a minute. Jesus is the Word. Word is something we speak. God speaks, and what he speaks is Jesus. What he wants is Jesus. His influence on the world is Jesus. It's just a great way of saying how complete and how good Jesus is. John's gospel is broken up into two parts. Signs, it's, I don't know if you know classical music, bolero starts out real soft with a certain melody, and then it just gets more instruments and gets up more and 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 more. And then it, by the end, it has all the instruments. It's a big thing. That's kind of what the signs are. Signs are progressively more influential until we get to the point that he raises Lazarus from the dead, and then it turns into the book of glory where Jesus is walking to the cross. Of course, he knows it's all going to happen, and he's in charge of it all, and it's all being orchestrated by him. You get that feeling in the book of John. The structure, that's the structure that it has. The stories are much longer. They're much more deep, entailed with conversation. Jesus has a kind of higher, lofty, sometimes often misunderstood perspective where somebody's talking about water and Jesus talking about living water, but nevertheless, that's the mode of John. Eyewitnesses throughout John, there's always these parentheses where the editor walks into the gospel and tells them, hey man, we have people that have seen this. We're telling you so that you'd believe this too. That's in there all the time. I mentioned before that there are chapter stories. There's whole books of the chapter that we're going to talk about. Chapter 2 has 2 stories in it. And both those stories give us an understanding. All through John are misunderstandings, and Jesus has to constantly explain. You have people that are here and people that are, and Jesus here, and they just keep going until they get a common understanding. Jesus in John says he is God. He is the way, the truth, the life. That is not in the synoptic gospels. That's a revelation that comes through John. His message is not to follow the Torah, not to follow a new set of laws, it's love, 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 love. He's a Beatle. Love, love, love. That's what his message is. I think there's a purity of that is really good, and I think an important part of that. There's also a mystery, and that mystery is who in the world, in the second part of the gospel, is the disciple that Jesus loved. That is a classic mystery, and we'll probably talk about that more when we get towards the end. Light and darkness are often talked about. That's a nice scene. The scenes always talk about light and darkness, and there's a lot of motifs that are certainly with when we talk about John the Baptist. and we talk about different symbolism. A lot of that comes from the Essene, because we have writings from the Essenes, and those are the themes that are common to them. So that's kind of the interesting thing. John is very symbolic. We'll pick that up real quick in chapter 2. But the symbols, there's one story that's on a surface story, and there's another story where Jesus is telling us a whole different thing. And it's so much fun to dig for that. Ego eimi is I am in Greek. Jesus constantly says, I am, I am, I am. I am the way, the truth, the life. I am the gate. I am the gatekeeper. I mean, Jesus tells us, I am the vine. Jesus tells us all that. To just say, I am, which is the name of God in the Old Testament, is a big deal. But he is the way, the truth, the life. That's a really big part of the witness from the Gospel of John. So I wanted to share with you some kind of intro into the Gospel of John, so that you can kind of get an idea of the different things we're talking about. So from there, we will pursue each one of the chapters, and hopefully you will enjoy what we're going to go through. So God bless you, and thank you for listening.